Hello and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering EDH deck tech idea. If you want to bring something really spicy to your next tables of Commander, stay tuned because today we are taking a look at Xu-Ifit, Osteoharmonist. But before we jump into today's video, I want to make a shout out for Mythatom. Check out their high quality Magic the Gathering and other fantasy products via the link in the notes below and use my discount code LATSEL for 10% off your order. This is a mono black commander that has a very unique activated ability. It is a 3 mana 2/3 and you can tap it to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. But this comes at a cost because all creatures returned this way have no abilities and are skeletons in addition to their other types, and you can only do this at sorcery speed. Before we jump into today's video, always make sure to check out my full deck list in the notes below, and beforehand I want to let you know that this deck can be played in a very optimized way by reanimating a bunch of powerful creatures and then sacrificing them into something like Altar of Dementia, for example, and then giving them something like an Undying effect before and reanimating them with all of their powerful effects. But I think this completely destroys the whole vibe of this commander, so I have built this deck to be a vanilla beatdown deck, which simply wants to reanimate a bunch of high power and toughness creatures and swing with them as vanillas for the win. As we are in mono black, we start with a bunch of ramping in the early game and also playing a bunch of removal. A great mana rock, especially in monocolored decks, is Scepter of Eternal Glory. This is a better Gilded Lotus in some way because you can tap it for 1 mana, and if you have enough lands with the same name, it also taps for 3 mana just as the Gilded Lotus. As we are a monocolored deck, your chances will be very high that you will have enough simple basic swarms on the battlefield to activate this better mana ability. When it comes to monocolored decks, we of course always play the medallions, which is why we play Jet Medallion to discount all of our black spells. As I have said in my last video, we also play here the Darkness Crystal, an absolute staple in every monocolored deck in my opinion, because it does everything for us. We have a discount for all of our black spells, we have exile, removal when something of our opponents die, at least I think non-token creatures die, we gain life with that, and we have another reanimation tool that we can use with this artifact. Just as Scepter of Eternal Glory and the Darkness Crystal, these are a bit more expensive mana rocks, but we are absolutely fine with playing them because Scepter of Eternal Glory gives us a huge mana advantage, and the Darkness Crystal provides even more extra value, which we definitely want to use. When it comes to monocolored decks, we also play Throne of Eldraine, and this is also a really expensive mana rock, but it does several things, which is why it is okay to play it as a mana rock. Because the mana that it generates can be used on different spells, and even better is its activated ability to also draw us a bunch of cards if we got handled by our opponents and want to rebuild by drawing a bunch of cards, which we then can use to take over the game again. Of course, for really impactful turns, we also play Dark Ritual, kinda a staple in commander decks which include black, but I also gotta say that it works like a ritual and also accelerates you really fast in 1 turn. So many play groups maybe don't like this one, so you can maybe adjust it with a simple 2 mana rock which taps for 1. As we are on mono black, we also play Cryptghast, which generates us extra mana when we tap a Swarm for mana, and you also shouldn't forget about its Extort ability, which can also stabilize our life total once we are in a tougher spot. Sticking to the early game, especially when we are in black, we also play a bunch of Edicts in my opinion, as they are really powerful. For example, Sheoldred's Edict. In the best case, this card turns out to be a 3-for-1 trade, which will put you really far ahead in the game, even if it doesn't look like it on the first look. Even if you only take out a few mana dogs of your opponents, you still traded one of your cards for 3 of your opponents. Another really good card in this deck is Will of the Abzan, simply because it has a very powerful effect when our commander's on the battlefield, as we can use both modes, but even the single modes are really strong, as we have a Sorcery Edict effect for all of our opponents and also make them lose life, and in addition to that, we could also reanimate one of our creatures, and even though I said I have built this deck to be a vanilla beatdown deck, most of the creatures in this deck are extremely powerful on their own, and we can still reanimate them with Will of the Abzan. A card that is heavily overlooked simply because it doesn't have that many print runs, I also believe it only has 1 print run so far, is Maya in Misery. Sure, it is a Sorcery Edict effect, but it also targets enchantments of your opponents. So if 2 of your opponents played a mana dog, for example, and the other one enchanted one of their lands with Wild Growth, This still hits all of your opponents, setting all of them back. When it comes to single target removal in black decks, we definitely have to play Defile. This card is so underrated and I barely see it nowadays, but it's so strong. If you are playing a monocolored deck, you gotta play Defile, come on man. And now something that synergizes with our commander. Another sorcery removal spell for a single target is Bone Shards. Its additional cost is to discard a card or also to sacrifice a creature, but in the most cases we will decide to discard a card simply because we cannot avoid drawing a few of our bombs that we actually want to reanimate, so we need discard outlets, and Bone Shards works super well with this type of deck. In addition to that, we have kind of the same effect at an instant speed spell because we play Bitter Triumph. Either we pay life or we discard one of our bombs that we want to reanimate later to take out one of our opponent's threats. And now I've made a really good shift about how we fill up our graveyard. My personal favorite card when it comes to looting effects is Collector's Vault. This is a very underrated uncommon from Wilds of Eldraine, and you pay 2 mana to tap it to draw a card and discard a card and create a treasure token. The really powerful thing about this card is creating the treasure token, which really accelerates you and definitely feeds into your strategy. I play this card in my Croxa and Konoros Reanimator deck, and every time this one hits the battlefield, my opponents know what's about to come, so either they handle it or they simply cannot handle it as they don't have any interaction, and I accelerate so fast and it does exactly what all of my Reanimator decks want to do. In addition to that, we play Matsalanti, the Great Door, another great artifact that really helps us with doing what we want to do. We draw a card, we discard a card, and we also have the option to transform it into the core, which can also generate us a huge mana advantage at some point because we keep filling our graveyard with cards. Another card that I haven't seen much when it comes to this card is Zombie Infestation. Of course, you gotta have to discard 2 cards to also create a zombie token, which is not the best payoff, but especially in a deck like this where you draw a bunch of bombs over the whole game that you want to have in your graveyard, this can actually have a really good payoff. Now that I'm doing this video, I'm also starting to realize that a few Madness cards would be great in this deck, but I don't think that there are that many good Madness cards in mono black that would fit into the strategy, but I will check that out again and maybe link those cards in the sideboard. Another card that came out with Bloombrower is Dire Sight, a great instant speed spell that lets us surveil 2, then draw 2 cards at the price of 2 life. This is the better read the bounce in my opinion, and this deck definitely proves why, because we surveil and we don't scry. Many decks definitely want all of these cards in their graveyard because many decks out there run reanimation strategies or synergies with their graveyard, and Dire Sight does exactly that. Another great card when it comes to graveyard synergies is Ripples of Undeath. If you can commit this one early to the battlefield, it will fill your graveyard over the whole game. Of course, it will set you back a little bit if you decide to take something back because you have to pay 1 mana for it, but if you're playing the early game slow or just playing Edict after Edict, it can be enough simply because you can still secure your land drop with Ripples of Undeath at the price of 3 life and 1 mana, play your land and still have Sheoldred's Edict or another Edict available that you can use. Another card from Edge of the Eternities is Hymn of the Faller, another great sorcery card that lets us surveil, draw a card, and if we for example played an Edict effect before, we also get to draw another card. And now let's talk about cards that we want to turn into bombs to simply beat down our opponents with vanillas. We play Draco, a 16/16 with a bunch of text on it which we don't care about, simply because we want to throw this one into our graveyard and then reanimate with our commander to have a 16/16 on board that can swing in the next turn. Kinda a similar effect comes from Death Shadow, which we can put easily into our graveyard, for example on turn 1, as we simply just cast it for 1 mana. It will kill itself due to its ability, will be in our graveyard, and later on we can immediately reanimate it and have a 13/13 on board. The cards that I'm featuring here are mostly the highest power and toughness stats that you will see in this deck list, but that's the reason how I've built this deck to be a vanilla beatdown deck, which is also why we play Ancient Stone Idol. This is a 12/12 that will simply beat our opponents down over the course of the game, and we also might be able to hardcast it at some point depending on our matchup and which deck our opponents are playing. We also play Ulamog's Dreadsire, another really powerful creature. I believe it's a 10/10 and also has a really cool activated ability. Of course, if we reanimate it with our commander, it won't have those abilities, but what I also think is really strong about our commander is that it doesn't put anything like a finality counter or something onto those creatures, which simply allows us that if those creatures die at some point, and we have some other synergies like reanimation synergies, or at some point due to Cryptghast and all of our other mana acceleration, to simply hardcast those creatures and use their activated or triggered abilities which they have, which can be really cool and also an alternative win con in this deck. In the early game, we want to use our commander to bring powerful vanillas onto the battlefield, and later on, we might be at the point that we can simply hardcast all of our bombs and profit from all of their abilities. We also go with cards like Desolation Twin, Void Winnower, or It That Betrays, which can also be really powerful if we hardcast them later on. And now let's talk about a few very powerful support creatures in this deck, starting off with Ghoulcaller Gisa, as we commit a bunch of powerful creatures onto the battlefield with our commander, which doesn't cost us any mana, and we have Ghoulcaller Gisa also on the battlefield. We can at some point simply use her activated ability to sacrifice those creatures and create a huge army of zombies, which we can also swing with. The great thing about Ghoulcaller Gisa in this deck is that we have a bunch of Anthem creatures which also pump up zombies and not only skeletons, but we will get to that in a minute. Just as I have said with Ghoulcaller Gisa, we also play Gisa the Hellraiser. As we also play a bunch of single target removal and interactive spells, this card can trigger a bunch of crimes, which will also create an army of zombies, and in addition to that, it also Anthem up skeletons, which is another great thing to know about this card and a great synergy in this deck. As we have a bunch of vanillas, our opponents can simply jump block those creatures at some point. But we also play Death Baron, another Anthem effect, and it also gives our skeletons Death Touch, which is another great Anthem that we simply want to play in this deck. Another synergy comes with Death Priest of Myrkul, another Anthem creature which also has a nice end step trigger to create another token that will just Anthem up our army overall by another body, and also use all of its Anthem abilities. Another Anthem creature is Skeleton Crew, another creature that we can also recur itself from our graveyard to Anthem up our whole board. And we can also re-sacrifice our Skeleton Crew over and over again to other sacrifice synergies, for example Ghoulcaller Gisa or a few others that I will mention in a minute. Or maybe not a minute, because we also play Shadowheart Dark Justicar. Just as Disciple of Bolas, which is also played in this deck, both have kind of the similar effects when they either get activated or enter the battlefield, because we can sacrifice a creature to draw a bunch of cards, and when it comes to Disciple of Bolas, we can also gain a bunch of life. And as we are playing cards like Draco, which is a 16/16, or Ancient Stone Idol, which is a 12/12, these cards can be absolute game changers in this deck, and I think this is really cool, because the card advantage in this deck is earned honestly in my opinion, because we have to activate our commander, we have to reanimate something, we need to activate Shadowheart, or we need to commit Disciple of Bolas to the battlefield, which feels really honest in my opinion. As you know, I'm not a big fan of cards like Smothering Tithe or Rhystic Study, and this deck does exactly that. It works really honest, and it seems like a really cool deck because of this vanilla beatdown vibe, which also scales into the late game, because as I've said earlier, we can also simply hardcast all of our bombs at some point, which is really powerful. And now let's talk about cards that will win you more games. We will start off with Teval's Judgment. We can reanimate a bunch of cards over the course of the game. And also having leave the graveyard triggers, which will also gain us even more profit by either creating tokens, drawing us cards, making treasure tokens. This is exactly what we want to play in this deck, and I would also say a must-play card in this deck. Another card that probably everybody of you has laying around in their bulk is Gaia-Reach Sanitarium. You might be asking yourself, hey, why is this guy featuring a land in the Win More section? But I think, especially a land that costs like, I don't know, 20 cents or something like that, it can do a lot of work in this deck, and it is worth mentioning. Simply because you got your looting effect on a land, which is really hard to interact with your opponents. They can handle cards like your Collector's Vault, your Ripples of Undeath, and they will see it as a threat. But everybody overlooks lands. And this is also something why I, for example, try to feature a Demolition Field in all of my decks, simply to be able to handle powerful utility lands. And I think Gaia-Reach Sanitarium does exactly that. The best card in this deck is Corpses of the Lost. This is an enchantment which you can replay over and over again, but we care about its first line, simply because it gives all of our skeletons haste, and our commander turns our reanimated creatures into skeletons. And mono black haste enabling is something really tough, and if you can commit this one to the battlefield, let's assume we played our commander, we have a bomb in our graveyard, and in the next turn cycle, we can commit the Corpses of the Lost onto the battlefield, have our haste enabler ready, tap our commander and reanimate our Draco, and it immediately has haste. It can definitely surprise an opponent out of nowhere, and this is why I want to highlight this card, as we can immediately slap somebody for like 16, 17, whatever. And if they don't handle this card, you got a haste enabler in mono black. How cool is that? As I have said earlier, this deck also can be played in a very different way. You want to, for example, play Undying effects like from Mikaeus the Unhallowed, or you can play cards like Feign Death, Undying Evil. There's also this other one from Wilds of Eldraine, which is really strong, that simply says if a creature of yours die, it comes back to the battlefield, because it resets the abilities of your creatures, which is how you can bring them back easily with your commander once you've put them into your graveyard. Sacrifice them for additional value, for example into something like Altar of Dementia, mill yourself even more, then sacrifice them, or you've sacrificed them to mill yourself, and then you'll be at the point where you have like your Undying effect on this creature, and you're like, okay, now I have this It That Betrays, which is simply ready to go, which is huge. Equip Lightning Greaves, bring somebody out. Yes, this is really powerful, but I found it way more interesting to simply go for the way of beating your opponents down with vanilla creatures. I think that sounds so cool and so unique. It's something that, as I've said earlier, if you want to spice your commander table up, bring this deck to the table. And another card that also works in this deck, you can also flicker cards. Conjurer's Closet is something that can do a lot of work in this deck, simply because in your end step you will flicker the creature that you have just reanimated, and as it will be a new instant of the card, you will have all of the abilities back on the creature, which is also really strong, really cool, yeah, but it won't be a vanilla anymore, which is something that I want to focus in this deck. Alright guys, let me know which cards you would add to the deck, which legendary creature I shall feature next. Make sure to check out my deck list in the notes below, and then I would say see you in the next one. Goodbye guys.